The soft glow of the bedside lamp bathed the room in warm light. My body sank deeper into the plush mattress, cocooned in the scent of lavender and Mark's cologne. The night had been perfect. Champagne, laughter, whispered promises between tangled sheets. A rare moment where the world outside didn't exist, just the two of us, lost in each other. I reached for him, fingers brushing against the smooth silk of the pillow. His side of the bed was still warm, his breathing steady beside me. A smile curled on my lips as I pulled the blanket closer. Then, the sharp buzz of my phone cut through the silence. Groggy, I fumbled for it, squinting at the screen. Mark. Confused, I swiped to answer, my voice thick with sleep. "Babe?" The line crackled, static hissing like a distant whisper before his voice broke through. "Hey, I'm so sorry. My flight got delayed. I'll be at the hotel in an hour." The air in my lungs turned to stone. My body froze, muscles locking into place. My fingers clenched around the phone as I slowly turned my head. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. There, beside me, Mark was still in bed. His back rose and fell in steady rhythm, the sheets shifting with each slow breath. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The warmth of his body, the weight of him against the mattress. It was real, wasn't it? My breath came out shaky. "Mark?" I whispered. He didn't respond. The room felt colder, the air thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. My fingers twitched, itching to reach out and shake him awake. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut, twisting like a living thing. My pulse pounded as I leaned closer. I swallowed the lump in my throat, pushing past the tightness in my chest. "Mark?" I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, not a normal sleepy sigh, something deeper, something that rattled through the room like a dying breath. The hairs on my arms rose. Then he moved. His body rolled onto his side, slow, deliberate. My stomach lurched as his face came into view, but his eyes stayed closed. His lips parted, voice soft. "Wrong. I'm already here." The lamp flickered. The sheets crawled as if shifting beneath unseen hands. The weight of something unseen pressed into my chest, forcing the breath from my lungs. The room wasn't empty. A cold shiver crawled down my spine, the weight of his words pressing against my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, my mind screaming at me to run. But where? My hand clenched the sheet, my nails digging into the fabric. The bed suddenly felt too small, the air thick and suffocating. His body lay still, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. But something was off, something I couldn't explain. His breaths were too deep, too controlled, like he was waiting. My heart pounded as I reached out, my fingers trembling. I needed to touch him, to prove to myself that this was real. The moment my fingertips brushed his arm, the air shifted, the room groaned, the temperature dropping so fast my breath curled into mist. His skin was too smooth, too cold, like marble left out in winter. My stomach clenched. This wasn't Mark. This wasn't him. I yanked my hand back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Think, Rachel, the phone. Where was my phone? My eyes darted toward the nightstand, but the screen was dark now, lifeless. My fingers shook as I reached for it, fumbling to unlock it. The call with Mark? Had I imagined it? Then he moved again, slowly, methodically. His hand stretched toward me, his fingers too long, too stiff. The sound of the sheets shifting beneath him felt wrong, like dry leaves scraping against wood. His lips parted slightly, his breath shallow, wheezing. My stomach twisted. He was watching me. His eyes were still closed. The lamp flickered again, the shadows in the corners stretching, twisting. I scrambled back, the mattress shifting beneath me. The second I moved, his head tilted slightly. Not in a natural way, it was too sharp, too sudden, like a puppet responding to invisible strings. "Mark?" My voice cracked, barely a whisper. I don't know why I said his name. This wasn't Mark. I knew it, felt it. But I needed to hear something, anything, to break the silence, to prove I wasn't trapped in some waking nightmare. His lips twitched, a smile. Barely there, wrong. His voice came out in a low, hollow rasp. "I'm already here." My stomach dropped. He had said it before, the exact same way, like a recording. The realization hit me like a freight train, panic sinking its claws deep into my chest. This thing wasn't speaking to me. It was repeating, like it had been programmed, like it had said these words before. The lights flickered violently, shadows lurching across the walls. The air grew thick with the scent of something damp, rotten. The bed shifted again. Then his eyes opened. His eyes were wrong. They weren't Mark's deep brown, the ones that softened when he laughed, the ones that made me feel safe. These were hollow, endless, twin black voids, swallowing the dim light of the room. My stomach lurched as something deep inside me screamed, "Run!" My breath hitched as he blinked, the motion too slow, too deliberate. His pupils never shrank, never reflected the light. They were empty. My body refused to move, paralyzed under his gaze. My fingers twitched against the sheets, but it felt like the room itself was pressing down on me. A slow grin stretched across his face, too wide, too unnatural. His lips didn't move like skin should. They stretched, pulling as though something else was wearing his face. I squeezed my eyes shut, heartbeat hammering in my throat. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Then he spoke. Or something did. "You shouldn't have let me in." The words were layered, like more than one voice spoke them at once. Mark's voice was in there, but so was something else. Something deeper, something old. The sound vibrated through my bones, rattling in my chest. I bolted. The second I moved, the lights died completely. The darkness slammed into me, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like it was alive. My fingers fumbled for the nightstand, the lamp, anything to break this void. I felt fabric. The sheets? No. Something grabbed my wrist. I screamed. My body twisted, pulling away with everything I had. My fingers clawed at the air, at the walls, desperate for an escape. The grip tightened. Cold, sharp, inhuman. It yanked me back, the strength of it sending me crashing into the bed. I gasped for breath, my limbs tangled, my mind spiraling into terror. The shape in the darkness. It was still there, watching. My ears rang as a voice, low and guttural, whispered into my ear. It knew my name. My stomach twisted violently, nausea churning through me. I scrambled off the bed, hitting the floor hard. My hands slapped against the cold wood, the impact jarring my bones. "Move. Get out. Now." My knees nearly buckled as I stumbled toward the door. The sheets rustled behind me. The voice called again, softer now, mocking. "Where are you going? We're not done yet." My fingers clawed at the doorknob, twisting, pulling. Locked. I whimpered, my chest tightening. This wasn't right. I had never locked it. I was trapped. With it. And then I heard footsteps, not behind me. Outside the door, a familiar voice called out, muffled through the thick wood. "Rachel, it's me. Open up." My blood turned to ice. It was Mark. The voice outside was Mark's. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run to him, to throw the door open and collapse into his arms. But something inside me, the same instinct that had frozen me in bed moments ago, held me back. My fingers trembled against the doorknob. Behind me, the bed creaked, slow, deliberate. It was still there, watching. I could feel it. The weight of its stare pressing into my back. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was shrinking. I wasn't alone, but I also wasn't sure if I was safe on either side of this door. "Rachel?" Mark's voice again, softer now, concerned. My breath came out in sharp gasps, my thoughts spiraling. If he was out there, who was behind me? My hands shook as I pressed my ear to the door. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of shuffling, no faint hum of the hotel's ventilation. Just empty silence. Then the voice changed. "Rachel, let me in!" Mark's voice. But it wasn't his anymore. It flattened, emotionless, like a bad recording, like something trying to sound human. My breath hitched and the air in my lungs turned ice cold. It knew I was hesitating. The lights flickered violently, the bulb buzzing like it was straining to stay alive. Behind me, the bed creaked again, and I didn't have to turn around to know it was closer. My stomach twisted, nausea curling in my throat. The doorknob moved. My body jolted as it twisted under an unseen hand from the outside. The door rattled against the frame, slow at first, then harder, more frantic. A fist pounded against the wood, a deep thud, thud, thud that sent my heart into overdrive. "Open the door, Rachel," I whimpered, pressing my body against the wood. I couldn't let it in. I couldn't let either of them in. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. My eyes darted to the window. The hotel was on the 4th floor. Too high to jump, but maybe there was a ledge. Behind me, the sheets slid to the floor. My breath caught. The thing in the bed was standing now, watching, waiting. It hadn't spoken since Mark's voice came. My fingers gripped the doorknob so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, a whisper, right behind me. "You don't get to leave." The lights went out. My scream never even left my lips. When Mark finally arrived, the door was locked from the inside. Hotel security had to force it open. The room was empty. The bed was still warm. Rachel's belongings were untouched, her phone still on the nightstand. There was only one thing out of place. A single handprint on the inside of the window, smudged, as if someone had been pulled away. The cabin smelled of cedar and old books, the kind of place that made you want to sink into a blanket with hot cocoa. Daniel tossed the bags onto the couch while Sarah stretched, sighing contentedly. They had planned this getaway for months. No work, no responsibilities, just the two of them in the middle of nowhere. The snow outside piled against the porch steps, muffling the world beyond the trees. Sarah was the first to notice the letter. It lay neatly on the nightstand, edges crisp, as though it had just been placed there. No envelope, just a folded sheet of thick, expensive-feeling paper. She picked it up, brow furrowing. "Welcome, Daniel and Sarah." Daniel glanced over her shoulder, grinning. "Oh, fancy, complimentary love notes." Sarah laughed, unfolding the page further. But as her eyes scanned the text, the color drained from her face. "Tonight will be unforgettable. You'll drink wine by the fire. Sarah will say she's cold. Daniel will make her tea. You'll make love beneath the blankets. Then she will whisper in his ear the words she's never said before." Daniel frowned. "Wait, what?" Sarah swallowed. It's probably from the Airbnb host. Like a cute little itinerary thing?" She forced a chuckle, but her fingers trembled. Daniel smirked, snatching the letter. "Let's see what else they got planned for us." He skimmed the next lines. "Daniel will wake at 3:12 a.m. He will hear Sarah at the window, reading this note. But she won't be in bed. She won't be anywhere he expects her to be." The air in the room thickened, like the walls had inhaled with them. Daniel looked at Sarah, his grin faltering. She laughed, too high-pitched. Okay, this is a prank." "Who would go through the trouble?" Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "It's weirdly detailed." Sarah folded the letter, pressing it against her chest like it might burn through her fingers. "It's nothing. Let's enjoy our weekend, okay?" The fire crackled as Daniel poured them both glasses of wine. The night stretched on, slow and syrupy. Sarah nestled against him, murmuring about how perfect everything was, how quiet, how peaceful, but neither of them looked at the nightstand. Neither of them mentioned the letter again. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the air stood still. The fire burned low, the last embers cracking like distant whispers. Sarah stirred beside him, sighing in her sleep. Daniel blinked at the ceiling, the weight of wine and exhaustion pressing on him. The cabin was silent, too silent. His eyes drifted to the clock on the nightstand. 3:12 a.m. A deep, involuntary chill ran through him. No, just a coincidence. It had to be. Then he heard it. Soft, deliberate, murmuring. His breath hitched. The sound wasn't coming from the bed. It was coming from the window. Daniel's pulse pounded as he turned his head, barely daring to look. Sarah stood by the glass, the pale moonlight washing over her face. The letter trembled in her hands as she whispered the words. Daniel will wake at 3:12 a.m. He will hear Sarah at the window, reading this note, but she won't be in bed. She won't be anywhere he expects her to be. His stomach clenched. His breath turned shallow. Sarah! His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. She didn't react, didn't even blink. The firelight flickered, casting her long shadow against the wooden floor. Slowly, she tilted her head. Her lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was lower, hollow. It's already happening. Daniel's body locked in place. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. This is a dream. I'm still asleep. The sheets beside him were still warm. Sarah hadn't left the bed. His gaze snapped back to the window, but she was still there. A sharp, ice-cold sensation bloomed across his back, like a breath, like fingers pressing into his spine. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to thrash, but his body was a prison of ice. He felt the weight shift behind him. Something else was in the bed, and it was breathing. Sarah turned her head sharply, her dark eyes locking onto him. Her mouth moved, forming words in a voice not her own. He never wakes up. Daniel gasped, a strangled, desperate sound. The room went dark. The darkness swallowed everything. The fire, the walls, even the air itself. Gone, as if someone had snuffed out existence. Daniel's chest heaved, but he couldn't hear his own breath. The weight beside him shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement. His fingers dug into the mattress. It was warm, too warm. His body screamed at him to move, to run, but the cold pressure against his back had turned unbearable, like unseen hands pinning him down. Then the whisper came, right against his ear, not Sarah's, not human. You're already too late. Daniel bolted upright. The cabin snapped back into view, the firelight flickering dimly against the wooden walls. His lungs dragged in sharp, stinging air. Sweat slicked his skin, but the sheets were still neatly tucked around him, untouched. The clock on the nightstand read 3:13 a.m. Sarah was gone. His head snapped toward the window. Empty. The letter lay crumpled on the floor, the edges curling in the heat. Daniel's heart pounded. He threw the blanket off and stumbled toward the door, nearly tripping over himself. Sarah? His voice came out cracked. He scanned the cabin, every shadow suddenly too deep, every corner yawning like an open mouth. His hand brushed the doorknob, slick with sweat, as he yanked it open. Snow stretched endlessly under the full moon, untouched except for a single set of footprints leading toward the tree line. His stomach twisted. Barefoot. Daniel didn't hesitate. He bolted outside, the cold stabbing into his skin, his breath curling like smoke. Sarah! His voice shattered the stillness, swallowed by the towering pines. The footprints led deeper, disappearing into the trees like they had been waiting for him. A shape stood at the edge of the woods. Sarah, barefoot, still wearing her sleep shirt. Her back was turned to him, her arms limp at her sides. He exhaled, relief crashing into him like a wave. Jesus, Sarah, what the hell are you doing? He crossed the snow quickly, reaching for her shoulder. She turned. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Her lips shaped words, words he couldn't hear. His fingers brushed her skin. Everything collapsed. The ground wasn't there, the trees weren't there. Sarah's face twisted, her features warping into something unrecognizable, her eyes too black, her smile too wide. Daniel screamed. The world went silent. Daniel couldn't breathe. The air turned thick, suffocating, as if the entire world had been ripped away. His feet no longer touched the ground, yet he wasn't falling. He was sinking. Sarah, or whatever was wearing her face, stood in front of him, her lips still moving soundlessly. Her eyes, once familiar and warm, were now pools of black, swallowing the faint light around them. Her smile stretched wider, unnatural, her teeth a jagged collection of something not human. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable. His ears rang with an eerie, high-pitched hum, like the sound of a television on static. He tried to move, to scream, to reach out for her, but his body wouldn't obey. Then the whisper returned, soft, gentle, inside his head. "You should have left when you had the chance." His body lurched forward. The darkness collapsed, folding in on itself, and suddenly he was back. The cabin was warm again, fire crackling softly. The sheets clung to his damp skin as if he had never left the bed. His breath came in ragged gasps. He twisted, expecting to see something, a shadow, a figure, some trace of what had just happened. But Sarah was lying beside him, asleep, peaceful, untouched. The clock read 3:14 a.m. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hands trembled as he pushed himself upright. Was it a dream, a nightmare so vivid it felt real? His fingers moved to touch Sarah's arm, to feel the warmth of her skin, to convince himself she was really there. Then he saw it, on the nightstand. A new letter. The edges were crisp, the ink fresh. His heart pounded as his hand hovered over it. He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to read it, but he had to. With shaking fingers, he unfolded the paper. "Welcome, Daniel and Sarah." His breath hitched. The words were the same, word for word, but this time there was one extra line. "He never wakes up." A chill clawed up his spine. His hands gripped the sheets. He turned to Sarah, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah?" She didn't move. The fire flickered. The walls seemed closer. The cabin felt too small. Sarah exhaled softly, her breath steady, even. But as Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dim glow, his stomach plummeted. Her lips were moving. She was whispering. But the sound wasn't hers. The cabin door creaked open, the wind howling through. Daniel never saw what stepped inside. Went to black.